The quiet return. Caleb Monroe had a way of standing that made people believe he had the answers. Shoulders square, jaw quiet, eyes that measured a space and saw what it could be before anyone else did. Clients trusted him for that. His crews followed him for it. Even his wife, once, had loved him for it. How certain he seemed about everything. Certainty, though, is a brittle thing. It doesn't bend, it breaks. In his early 40s, Caleb ran one of the most respected renovation firms in Western Maryland. His trucks carried his name, Monroe Construction, in black lettering so clean it could have been stenciled by God himself. He had 15 men on payroll, 2 office assistants, and a workshop that smelled of sawdust and diesel and promise. He built kitchens that could have been movie sets and porches that made neighbors jealous. At home, though, the hammer never found the nail. His wife, Lauren, had started calling herself a construction widow half-jokingly, but the laughter always arrived a second too late. She was a school counselor, a good one, steady voice, soft eyes, the kind of woman people told their secrets to. She used to save a seat for Caleb at every school play, every parent night. She stopped when she realized she'd been saving it for ghosts. Their kids, Evan, 15, and Maddie, 10, had learned to measure time by his absence. Evan kept his distance. Maddie kept asking when Daddy would be home. Caleb's answer was always the same. Soon. It was a word that had started to taste like sawdust. Every morning started the same. Black coffee, truck keys, the slow groan of a diesel engine warming in the driveway while the house lights flickered behind frosted glass. Lauren would wave from the kitchen, robe cinched, face unreadable in the reflection. Sometimes he'd wave back. Sometimes he wouldn't. By 6:30, he'd be at the site, walking the perimeter with his clipboard and thermos, already rewriting schedules in his head. He'd run his hand along drywall edges, check beams for plumb, tilt his head at the sound of nail guns firing too fast. The men liked him, respected him, but they also saw the fatigue. "Boss, you ever go home?" one of them once asked. "Sometimes," Caleb said, grinning. But even he didn't believe it. He wasn't drinking then, not really. A beer with dinner, maybe a whiskey at the shop while finishing invoices. It wasn't about the alcohol. It was about quieting the hum of everything left unfinished. The work, the apologies, the questions. He told himself he was building something that would last. That one more contract, one more edition, one more winter of 16-hour days would finally give him the time to rest. The lie worked, mostly because he said it while doing something noble, providing, succeeding, building. People don't question you when your lies come wrapped in productivity. It started with a client named Naomi Pierce, a widow in her late 30s, sharp as a roofing nail and lonely in a way that smelled familiar. He built her a new sunroom after a hailstorm shattered her old one. She brought lemonade to the crew every day and conversation to Caleb. Nothing happened for a long time. Nothing physical anyway. But attention is its own currency, and he was bankrupt everywhere else. Lauren noticed before he did. She didn't yell. She never yelled. She just grew silent, the way the world does right before a storm. "Do you love her?" she asked one night, her voice flat as a ruler. "There's no her," he said. "There's always a her," she replied. He didn't deny it fast enough. That was all it took. When he finally moved out, it wasn't dramatic. No slammed doors, no suitcases thrown. Just a cardboard box of work shirts, a duffel bag, and a man trying to convince himself that dignity was the same thing as being right. He rented a one-bedroom above a laundromat 2 towns over. The hum of the dryers filled the silence. He told the kids it was temporary. Evan stopped answering his texts after the 3rd week. Maddie drew him pictures, stick figures under blue skies, but her handwriting got smaller each time. Lauren filed for divorce quietly, efficiently. She didn't ask for more than she needed, but she took everything that mattered. Within 6 months, Monroe Construction started slipping. His foreman quit. 2 clients sued for delays. The new project slowed, then stopped. By the following winter, the sign on his workshop door read "Available for lease." He drove past it once, just to see if it still hurt. It did. The first job he found after closing the company was in Pennsylvania. Contract labor for a disaster repair outfit called Northline Services. Storms, floods, fallen trees, broken glass. He worked cleanup crews, patching roofs for strangers while his own life stayed cracked wide open. He drove a company truck now. No name on the side, just a fleet number. At night, he'd sit in motel rooms lit by TV static and eat out of takeout containers, wondering what Evan's voice sounded like at 17. He tried calling once, on the boy's birthday. Lauren answered. Hey, she said. Hey. A pause. Long enough to remember what talking used to feel like. Happy birthday to him, Caleb said. I'll tell him, she said, and didn't. 3 years later, by the time Evan was in college, Caleb had stopped introducing himself as anything but a repairman. It was simpler that way. People didn't ask what you used to be when you carried a ladder. He'd grown leaner, quieter. His hands, once calloused from craftsmanship, had gone soft, then hard again from labor. There's a difference between building and fixing. Building is vision, fixing is penance. He'd learned to take both kinds of jobs, the ones that paid and the ones that paid him back a little. Fixing a broken railing for an old woman who couldn't afford it. Replacing drywall in a church after a storm, just for the smell of coffee and forgiveness. He never talked about his family. When people asked, he said they were doing fine. It was the only prayer he still believed in. It came in spring, 5 years after he left home. A thin envelope with his name typed neatly in blue ink. No return address, but he knew the handwriting inside before he even opened it. It was from Evan. Dad, I don't know why I'm writing this. I got accepted to a firm in Chicago. I start in June. They want me on a new development downtown. You'd probably like the design, lots of glass and metal. Clean lines. I guess I just thought you'd want to know. There was no phone number, no invitation. Just information, a breadcrumb, nothing more. Caleb sat on the motel bed, reading it over and over until the words blurred. Then he folded it carefully, slid it into his wallet behind his driver's license, and carried it like a second identity. For a while, life stayed small and predictable. He followed storms, fixed what the wind broke, slept in towns with names that sounded like sighs. Milford, Cedar Run, Pine Hollow. He stopped drinking altogether. It wasn't dramatic. Just one day, he realized the silence after a storm was louder when he was sober, and he wanted to hear it all. He kept the letter. He'd take it out sometimes, not to read it, but to remind himself that connection, any connection, was still possible, even if only one way. The phone call came in August, humid and mean. Monroe, his supervisor, said, "We got a big contract outside Chicago. High-profile job. Corporate tie-in with an architectural firm." "Which one?" Caleb asked, though his gut already knew. "Something called Avery and Pierce." "You in?" He didn't answer right away. The name sat in the air like a dare. "Yeah," he said finally. "I'm in." He hung up and sat still for a long time. The hum of the air conditioner filled the room, steady as a heartbeat. He reached into his wallet, touched the letter, and whispered to no one, "Guess it's time." The next morning, Caleb Monroe packed his tools, loaded the truck, and pointed the nose toward Chicago, toward the city where his son built skylines while he patched roofs. He didn't call ahead. He didn't plan what he'd say. He just drove, the highway unfolding like forgiveness, long, quiet, and still under construction. Chicago introduced itself by way of heat and scaffolding. In late August, the city was a kiln, steel warming under a high white sun, sidewalks giving back the day in waves. Caleb parked the Northline truck behind a row of orange barriers and stared up at the worksite, 4 stories of scaffolding wrapped around a brick warehouse with good bones and bad decades. The project banner read the windsock in tidy sans serif, with Avery and Pierce tucked in the corner like a signature. He didn't need to wonder if this was Evans. The lines told him, clean, unafraid, old brick married to glass with quiet confidence. Whoever drew it understood both weight and light. Northline's scope was pre-occupancy remediation, seal the envelope, address roof leaks, replace compromised joists, bring the old place tight and weather honest before the showier work came in. It was the kind of job that never made a press release but determined whether a building aged with dignity or became a complaint. A foreman with a clipped beard and a radio on his shoulder introduced himself. "Duncan," he said, offering a hand. "You're Monroe. Heard good things." "From who?" Caleb asked, fighting the useless rise of hope. "From your numbers," Duncan said, grinning. "Completion times, callbacks, 0. Guys like you make my week shorter." They climbed. The scaffolding flexed under boots. Truck beeps played bass in the street. A saw skittered somewhere like a nervous animal. Caleb breathed in the smell of sun-baked tar and pine, and something in him uncoiled. He felt it every time the work asked all of him and promised to use it well. Start with the north parapet, Duncan said, pointing. Water's coming in somewhere between that second lift and the cap. We've got an interior stain to prove it. I want it solved before Friday. Caleb nodded. He ran a knuckle along the brick, listening with his skin. Hairline fissures spidered from an old anchor. The cap flashed wrong. He didn't say it. He set to work. He stripped the loose mortar, packed new, reset lead flashing under the cap, where a lazy hand had overlapped instead of lapped. He sealed a decades-old patch seam with primer and patience. He checked the slope for water that wanted to wander. The heat pinned his shirt to his back. He drank, wiped, kept going. By noon, he was a three-color study in dust, sweat, and tar. By 2, the north parapet behaved. He misted it, watched the bead. No run where there shouldn't be. He wrote his notes exact, a habit he hadn't lost even when there was no one left to read them. He descended for more sealant and saw it then. A slim figure in a light shirt and hard hat, a roll of drawings under his arm, speaking with the site's superintendent near the loading bay. The stance was familiar in the way a song is, even when it's played on a new instrument. Shoulders that tried not to give away nerves. A head tilt Caleb remembered from homework at the kitchen table. Evan. The name rose in him like something struck, like the startle of a deer. The world did not flare or rush. It simply held, like a held breath, as if a note waited for its second half. Caleb didn't move. The superintendent, hard-used, focused, pointed at a doorway, then up. Evan nodded, smiled a professional smile, not wide, not timid. He didn't look toward the scaffolding. He didn't need to. Why would he? The world had taught him that men in numbered trucks were part of the city's background, necessary as garbage pickup, anonymous as weather. Caleb walked past them with the economy of a man who has learned not to make ripples. He kept his eyes on the job board, the pallet of seam tape, the drum of primer. He felt the swing of his arms like their motion belonged to someone else. On the second lift, a laborer with tattooed forearms said, "You good?" "Fine," Caleb said, and set a bead too perfect to be anything but grief in straight lines. The windsock had lived many lives. Warehouse, furniture showroom, idle vacancy, long windows boarded, then unboarded, then clouded with dust. Its brick was soft in places where winter had chewed too long. Its bones, though, were honest, heavy timber beams with checks like laugh lines, joists that hummed when trucks rolled by. Caleb liked buildings with memory. They forgave human error in a way brand new structures wouldn't. You could tell when a beam had held more than it should have and didn't complain. You could read, in the way a sill sank, the patience of wood. He thought about patience a lot. How much of it was a skill, and how much of it was love. On the third day, he found the second leak by listening. It wasn't where the stain suggested, which is how leaks joke. He crawled under a run of duct and saw the faint track where water had made a habit of defying gravity to follow a fastener thread. He backed out, replanned, and cut a clean patch around a penetrant someone had treated like a suggestion. He fastened to framing, not to sheet. He left a lip where a summer thunderhead could stand and think. Inside, the interiors team began peeling back drywall like old paint. They found more of what old places hide. A buckled sill, powder post eulogy where a sill plate had been. A young superintendent swore, pinched the bridge of his nose, and called in structural. 2 days later, they arrived. 3 people in clean boots and office posture, carrying tablets that displayed math under glass. Evan was with them, quiet at first, then precise. He put a hand on a beam like a doctor touching a patient's wrist, almost reverent. Caleb stood back in the semi-dark and listened to his son's voice echo into the rafters. It was lower than he remembered, threaded with a calm he didn't trust in himself at that age. Evan spoke the language of load paths and moisture content and sistering, and he did not oversell. He described choices: replace the sill, treat the beam, support temporarily with jack posts while they cut back rot. He was careful with degree and kind to the building. Open this bay to daylight, the structural engineer said at one point, exasperated. It's a money pit. Or it's a memory. Evan said, not confrontational, just sure. Then, what's your tolerance for dignity? Caleb felt that line under his ribs. They argued. They compromised. They kept the beam. That night in the motel, Caleb lay on his back and stared at a ceiling tile with a stain like a country he'd never visit. He replayed Evan's voice until the words were more about rhythm than content. He tried to imagine walking up to him on sight, introducing himself as if they were strangers, which they were. He imagined other scripts, the ones where men cry in lobbies and forgive each other at a loading dock at 5:12 p.m. He closed his eyes and let the fantasy go. Redemption, he'd learned, can't be rush-ordered. The best thing he could do for Evan, for the building, for the city that would live in it, was the work. Clean. Exact. No bleed. The first storm came the following Tuesday, one of those Midwestern July rewrites that arrives in August just to prove the calendar means nothing. The sky went sickly green, a wind took the corners of plastic sheeting and tried to teach it how to fly, and then rain walked in from the lake like it had a key. Caleb was on the roof when the first fat drops hit the cap sheet. He watched them splay, gather, and choose. Water has opinions. If you've done your work right, it chooses the path you made for it. If you've lied to yourself, it tells on you. He traced the beads as they raced to drains and over scuppers he'd kept clean on purpose. One slow rivulet tested his north parapet patch and shrugged. Good. Another slowed at a seam he'd fussed over until the sun moved, then took his slope down and away. Good. He watched rain check his math and grade him with tiny shoulders. By the time the worst passed, the roof held. The interiors sang with drips only in places they already knew about, and the site had the relief laugh men share when a thing hasn't broken under them. Down on the second floor, Evan walked with the structural team, pointing to the places that stayed dry, noting the few that didn't like a coach reviewing film. Roof held, Duncan said to Caleb, clapping him once on the shoulder, just one working man to another. Told you numbers don't lie. Caleb nodded. He didn't look down to the street where Evan stood. He didn't need to. The work had already gone there ahead of him and introduced itself. On a Thursday, the site shut early for a utility cutover. Caleb used the hour to find a grocery. He walked the aisles with a small cart and gravity in his knees. He chose a rotisserie chicken, a bag of green beans, a loaf of pre-sliced bread that made more promises with its seed mix than it kept. He turned into the condiments and nearly collided with him. Evan, holding a basket, reading a jar of pesto like it owed him an explanation. They did the mid-aisle dance, both apologizing, backing, moving, the choreography of strangers and sons. Sorry, Evan said. Caleb saw his own mouth in the shape of the apology. My fault, he said. His voice was steady. His hands were steady. That surprised him. Evan nodded, stepped past, and was gone. He smelled like clean laundry and late hours. Caleb stood in the aisle and pretended to be the kind of man who spent 5 minutes considering mustard. He didn't follow. He didn't leave the store and lean on brick and gasp. He picked a Dijon, paid for his chicken, and walked out into a city that had no idea two men had shared a geography lesson in aisle 7. Back in the motel, he ate with the TV low. He did not replay it. He let it pass through like weather, proof of where he was, not instruction for what to do next. The following week brought a site meeting that was more bodies than ideas. Developer, architect, structural, interiors, MEP, GC, and Northline. Somebody brought donuts. Somebody else put a box of them on a stack of gypsum and turned it into a table. The conversation moved in circles, tightening. Budget, timeline, sequencing. Evan spoke when he had to. He didn't perform. Caleb watched him out of the corner of his eye the way you watch your hands when you're using a new tool. Respectful, ready. Halfway through, someone pointed up. That corner, the developer said, always looks wet. We're treating it, the GC said. Old water. New fix. It's dry, Caleb said before he could decide whether to say it. Heads turned. His own voice sounded like it belonged in the room, but had just walked in. He gestured to his notes. Parapet crack and bad cap seam. We placed a test patch and sloped back to scupper. Last storm proofed it. Who are you? The developer said. Not rude. Just from a world where introductions must be credentials. Northline, Duncan said, stepping in. Monroe. He's the reason we only had 4 drips after a 100-year tantrum. I shifted. Evans stayed where they were, on the corner, then, slowly, on Caleb. A long beat. No recognition, but attention, which is the start of all recognition. Evan asked a question about fasteners. Caleb answered with the steadiness of 2 decades of work and 5 years of exile. For 3 minutes, they were just two men trying to keep a building honest. The room moved on. The donuts went stale politely. When it broke up, Caleb turned to leave. He felt a presence at his shoulder and knew it before it spoke. "You're Monroe," Evans said. The voice had a thread of curiosity in it, and something else. The test a young man gives a stranger to see if he can carry weight. "Yeah," Caleb said. "You find problems before they cost money," Evans said. It was not praise. It was a statement of alignment. "Here is a person whose gravity might match mine. I try to find them before they get proud," Caleb said. Evan huffed a laugh. "You ever want to be on the design side?" "I used to be on the building side," Caleb said before he could stop himself. Evan nodded like that made sense in an equation. Different church, same God. The structural engineer called him, and he went, and the moment folded back into the day. Caleb stood with his hands on his hips and watched the work go on. He didn't shake. He didn't sink. He just felt very awake. That night, he took the letter from his wallet and read it for the first time since arriving. The words were the same. He was not. He placed it on the motel desk and set his phone on top of it, as if weight could make choices. He could call. He could say, "I'm in your city and under your roof." He could say, "I know where you bought your pesto." He could say nothing and still be in a different universe of nearness than he had been for years. He put the phone back in his pocket. He made coffee from a packet that tasted like apologies. He sat at the little round table and sketched the roof in pencil on motel stationery, as if drawing it could remind him who he was when he was good. Redemption, when it comes at all, rarely arrives as trumpets. It arrives as small fixes that hold. Caleb began coming early to clear the scuppers before the day's dust tried to claim them. He taught a younger Northline guy named Reyes how to read a seam without touching it. He refused to be precious about knowledge. He gave it away the way older men had given it to him, without speeches, without keeping a private stash of secrets to ensure future invoice calls. On a hot Friday, he found a microsag under a skylight curb that would have become a puddle that would have become a complaint. He jacked the curb, slid in a shim he cut from scrap, refastened with patience, sealed, smoothed, stepped back. Clean. He wrote it up. He did not include his name in the report twice, hoping it would become a calling card. He wrote like a man speaking to the next man who would work here. "Here's what I found. Here's what I did. Here's why the water will go where we'd like it to go when it rains." Inside, the interior's crew found an original mosaic hidden under laminate in the lobby, greens and creams in a fish scale pattern. Someone suggested ripping it. Evans suggested keeping it. He didn't appeal to romance. He made a case for the way old craft makes new spaces breathe. The developer rolled his eyes and said if they could make the numbers work, he didn't care if they tiled it with seashells. Evan made the numbers work. That afternoon, he stood at the lobby's threshold with the rolling tool bag of a man who has learned that life rarely gives you both hands free. Caleb watched him from across the floor. He knew the weight of that bag, the way tools talk to your spine through a handle. He felt an absurd urge to offer to carry it, the way he used to lift his son when he fell asleep in the car and the house seemed too far away. Instead, he turned and carried 3 sheets of gypsum up 2 flights because that was a useful substitute for love. On Sunday, Caleb found a church by accident. He was walking, because the city asks you to at least try, and heard singing that sounded like a blueprint for breath. He stepped in the back. The sanctuary smelled like wood polish and summer. The pastor spoke about small faithfulness. Not the dramatic kind that spins itself on the headlines, but the kind that shows up with a mop. The sermon was short. The coffee was bad. He put 20 in the box and left quietly. In the alley behind the church, a man in a Cubs hat asked for 5 and got it. No speeches. He didn't suddenly become a different person. He became a person who knew what he was for that day, to make surfaces honest so other lives could happen on them without complaint. A week later, late afternoon, Caleb was on the 4th lift fastening a guard under a parapet cap when someone called up, "Monroe." He turned. Evan stood in the alley, hard hat under his arm, squinting. "Yeah." Caleb called. "You free for 10? Evan said. Caleb glanced at his watch though he didn't need to. "I can be." "Great," Evan said. He waited at the base while Caleb climbed down, took the ladder with the practiced quickness of a man who hasn't wasted steps in years. They stood in the noisy quiet of a city's back lane, where conversations belong to brick and steam vents more than to people. Quick question about the north parapet. Evan said, business first. He gestured with a folded plan. Your patch is holding, but we're thinking of carrying a cap detail into the return here. He showed it. Any reason you'd say no? Caleb leaned in, careful not to invade the space in ways that weren't about work. He looked. He saw the error waiting if the cap returned without a throat, a future bubble where pride would gather in spring. He pointed gently. If you throat it here, it'll shed. If you don't, it'll sulk. Evan considered. Sulk, he repeated, almost smiling. Got it. He folded the plan back. Thanks. He didn't leave. He stood with the feeling of a question that wasn't technical, trying to find language. Hey, he said finally. You been on a lot of our jobs? First, Caleb said. Evan nodded. He rocked on his heels. You from here? No, Caleb said. Just following weather. Storm work. And the leaks storms leave behind. Evan looked sideways at him, appraising not the man but the sentence, the way it let itself be true and not dramatic. He opened his mouth, closed it. Okay, he said simply. Thanks for the eyes. He turned and went back inside. Caleb watched him go and felt the very small, very real weight of a brick placed on a foundation where nothing had stood. He went back up the ladder and finished fastening the guard. He cleaned up. He wrote his notes. That night, he didn't take out the letter. He didn't need proof. He had a conversation, which in that season felt like currency you spend slowly and are grateful to have. By September, the nights cooled. The steel stopped burning hands at noon. The building began to resemble the drawings, which is always a magic trick. Where there had been speculation, there were now thresholds. Where there had been hope, there were anchors. Caleb stayed small and useful. He said yes when Duncan needed overtime and no when tiredness made no look like a gift. He bought Reyes lunch and told him to keep his receipts because receipts are a map out of certain traps. He replaced a strip of rotted sill in a rear exit nobody would brag about and felt more satisfaction than he'd admit. One evening, as he locked the roof hatch, Evan stepped out beside him with a paper cup of coffee and an apology of a smile. Figured roof guys don't mind coffee that tastes like nails, he said, offering it. Comes with the job, Caleb said, taking it. Their fingers didn't touch. The city spread west under a pink scrape of sky. Why windsock? Caleb asked, nodding at the banner visible from the roof edge. Old name, Evan said. Someone said the warehouse once stored fabric for kites. Or maybe it's just marketing. Either way, we kept it. Buildings deserve memory. They stood without more talk, looking out at a city that had given them both a kind of work and a kind of exile. The air turned the first early fall honest. Somewhere below, a forklift beeped the last of the day out of itself. Thanks for the throat detail, Evan said after a while. Saved us a phone call I don't like making. Happy to keep phones quiet, Caleb said. Evan smiled at that. It was small and genuine. He started toward the hatch, paused, and spoke without turning. You remind me of somebody, he said. Who? Caleb asked. His voice didn't shake. He kept it with his hands, which stayed on the rail and behaved. Myself, Evan said, and disappeared into the stairwell. Caleb stood a long time after that, coffee cooling, city breathing. He didn't cry. He didn't rehearse speeches. He just felt the clean weight of a day done well and the slight tilt of gravity changing in his favor. He finished the coffee. He cleaned his cup in the motel sink, because you take care of things that serve you. He slept without apology. The first cold front came in like a rehearsal for winter. Chicago thinned itself into gray lines, and the lake stopped pretending to be friendly. Inside the windsock, heaters hummed from borrowed circuits, paint buckets huddled near vents, and men moved slower now, their breath faint ghosts against drywall. Caleb welcomed the chill. Cold work made for steady hands and fewer words. The building was almost done. Scaffolds had come down from the east side, revealing brick that looked like it had waited a century for this second chance. Inside, light touched everything new and made it old in mercy. Evan walked the floors most days now, checking, correcting, translating design into reality. He spoke less, smiled more, carried himself like someone finally sure of his place in the room. Caleb watched him the way you watch a house you've just finished, admiring the structure but afraid to lean on it yet. It happened on a Tuesday, as ordinary as any. The day's work was done, tools were locked, circuits tagged. Caleb stopped at a diner 2 blocks away, the kind with cracked vinyl booths and pies that glowed under glass like fossils from better years. He ordered coffee and meatloaf. He wasn't hungry, but habit has its own appetite. When the door opened behind him, a gust carried the lake's chill and a voice that could still turn him young and guilty at once. "Excuse me, sorry, can I get this to go?" Evan. He hadn't seen him in regular clothes before, just denim and a coat, sleeves pushed up, phone in hand. The hostess smiled too long. Evan was handsome in a way that forgave you for noticing. Caleb stayed still, but the diner was small, and fate was tired of being patient. Evan turned, and recognition finally found him. It wasn't a cinematic double take. It was slower, a narrowing of the eyes, the kind of recognition that starts as this man looks familiar and ends as why does it hurt to see him? He froze. Then Dad. The word felt accidental, like it had fallen out of a pocket. Caleb didn't breathe. Evan. No one moved. A waitress poured coffee 2 booths over, pretending not to listen. Evan looked down, then back up, somewhere between anger and relief. "You work for Northline," he said, not asked, stated, because facts are safer than emotions. "I do." "For how long?" "5 years." "And you didn't." He stopped, pressed a hand to his face, half laugh, half disbelief. "You were on my site. You stood there, and you didn't say a word." "I didn't know what to say that would have helped," Caleb said quietly. They sat across from each other, a formality of water glasses and silverware between them. Evan didn't remove his coat. Caleb didn't reach for his. "So you just, what, travel around fixing other people's mistakes?" "Sometimes." "And you couldn't call?" "Not once in 5 years." "I called," Caleb said. "You didn't answer." Evan blinked. "I was 17. "I know. Then why stop trying?" Caleb rubbed a thumb along the edge of the napkin, slow. "Because every call felt like asking you to forgive me before you knew what for." Evan's jaw tightened. "You think silence is better? I thought it might hurt less." Evan laughed, a single short sound with nothing funny in it. "It didn't." Caleb nodded. "No, I guess it didn't." They sat again in the kind of quiet that has gravity. Forks clinked 2 tables away. The smell of onions and coffee rose like background noise for heartbreak. Finally, Evan asked, "Why are you here?" "This city. That project. Work sent me. That's all." "That's enough." Evan shook his head, fingers tapping the table like a man building courage one rhythm at a time. "Do you even know what that building means to me?" "I know what it's made of. It's the first one they let me lead," Evan said. "My name's on the plaque." He stopped. "It's everything I was trying to prove wasn't you." Caleb took that like a man should take a punch. Quiet, undramatic, letting the sting remind him he's still alive. "Looks like you proved it," he said. "That's not." Evan exhaled hard. "God, you always do that. Make it sound simple so no one has to feel anything." Caleb looked up then. "I feel it, son." The word landed between them like a fragile bridge. Evan stared at it, then looked away. "Yeah," he said. "Well, I don't know what to do with that." "Me neither." They left the diner together because leaving separately would have looked crueler than either wanted to be. Outside, the night had sharpened. The air smelled like metal and snow that hadn't decided yet. "Where are you staying?" Evan asked. "Motel off Belmont." "That's an hour from the site." "It's cheap," Caleb said, as if that explained every choice he'd made since leaving home. Evan nodded once, then asked quietly, "You still talk to Mom?" "Not for a long time. She's good. Retired last year. She teaches part-time now." "That sounds like her." Evan kicked at a crack in the sidewalk. "She thinks you're in Ohio." "Sometimes I am." "That's not an answer." "It's the truth," Caleb said. "Just not the part you want." They reached a corner where their paths would split, one toward the train, one toward the truck. Evan stopped. "You know, I used to hate you for leaving," he said. "Then I tried hating you for what came before that. Turns out it's exhausting." "I know. So what do you want from me now?" "Nothing," Caleb said. "That's convenient." "No," he said, softer. "That's mercy." Evan's breath fogged white in the air. He nodded once, almost respectful, then turned away. "See you at work, Mr. Monroe." And he walked off into the night. The next week passed in uneven quiet. Evan didn't avoid him, exactly, but the ease of professional distance returned, fragile as glass. They spoke, when needed, rarely about the building anymore. The air between them felt like a wound learning whether to scar or reopen. Caleb didn't push. He'd learned that redemption can't be negotiated. It can only be offered by example. So he showed up early. He stayed late. He double-checked other men's measurements and never mentioned it. He left notes that simply said, "Good catch." He didn't expect gratitude, but he started noticing that Evan lingered longer at the site, watching the small, invisible work that made the place safe. One evening, Evan asked, "You always this careful?" Caleb smiled without looking up. "Careful's cheaper than sorry." Friday brought closing day. The developer walked through. Cameras, the small brass plaque waiting to be unveiled. Evan wore a new jacket, pressed and sure. The building gleamed, every seam blessed by fresh paint and a week of vacuumed dust. Caleb stayed behind the scenes, sweeping the roof, pretending not to hear applause through the open vent. He didn't stay for the speeches. That night, he packed his tools, paid his motel bill, and left an envelope with the front desk, addressed in tidy block letters. E. Monroe, care of Avery and Pierce son. I didn't know how to say it without making it smaller than it is, so I'm writing instead. I'm sorry, not just for leaving, but for being half present when I stayed. For turning work into armor. For mistaking pride for purpose. You don't owe me forgiveness. I just needed you to know that every beam I've touched since was me trying to make something stand again. Dad, he left it. He didn't wait for an answer. He drove east that night, the highway long and kind to men who'd run out of speeches. 3 days later, in a town whose name he didn't notice, his phone buzzed. Unknown number. Hello. A pause. You left a letter, Evan said. His voice was steady, but the words carried miles. I did. You mean it. Every word. Silence. The kind that rearranges air. You didn't sign it with your full name, Evan said finally. Didn't want to make it about that. Another pause. Then, almost a whisper, you should have stayed for the ribbon cutting. I wasn't invited. You could have come anyway. Maybe next one. A breath. A small, tired laugh. You planning to build something? Always, Caleb said. Good, Evan said. Because I might have a project that needs someone who listens to water. Caleb closed his eyes, smiling small and private. Tell me where. I'll send the plans, Evan said. And Dad? Yeah. It held. The roof. Every inch of it. Good, Caleb said. That's all I ever wanted. The line clicked quiet, but it wasn't silence anymore. It was space. Space big enough for weather and forgiveness both. He put the phone down, started the truck, and drove toward morning. Winter arrived as if someone had thrown a switch. 1 week the city was a puzzle of gold leaves and exhaust haze. The next, wind came screaming down the river canyons, scouring every edge to steel. The Windsox ribbon cutting was already a photograph in some civic newsletter, the plaque already smudged by strangers' fingers. Evan's firm had moved on to another site, a school renovation in the South Loop, and Northline picked up the maintenance contract for the same building because the universe enjoys symmetry. Caleb pretended not to notice. He told himself it was just another job. New roof, old bones. The same small prayers he said every time he unpacked his tools. Let the seams hold. Let the weather stay where it belongs. But some mornings, as he parked across from the site and saw the Silver Company SUV already there, he had to sit an extra minute until his hands stopped remembering the diner, the letter, the phone call. It happened on a Wednesday, no drama, no foreshadow. Just a morning too cold for good footing. A plumber had left a coil of hose half frozen across the service roof, and when Caleb turned to answer a call from Duncan, his boot caught it. The world tilted, gravity remembered its job, and he went down hard. He felt the crack more than heard it, a bright sound deep inside his leg. Then silence. Pain came late, a blooming thing. By the time the EMTs arrived, he'd gone gray around the edges, but still argued about finishing the inspection report. They laughed, gently, the way people laugh when they're scared for you. Evan got the call from the GC because his name was on the contact sheet. Your guy Monroe took a fall, the voice said. My what? Caleb Monroe. That's the one. Ambulance just left Mercy General. Evan didn't remember the drive, only the parking ticket fluttering on his windshield afterward. Hospitals smell like bleach and disbelief. He found his father in a curtained cubicle, leg in a temporary cast, eyes closed against fluorescent light. The monitor beeped like a patient metronome. Hey, Evan said, voice too bright. Caleb opened one eye. Hey, broken tibia, Evan said, reading the chart like it was a planned set. They're scheduling surgery. Could have been worse, Caleb murmured. Didn't hit my head. Tool's okay. Evan almost laughed. You're unbelievable. Occupational hazard. The nurse came, asked for next of kin information. Evan hesitated only a second before saying, son. The word felt foreign in his mouth, but it fit. They let him stay through the surgery. He paced the corridor, hands shoved deep into coat pockets. Every phone buzzed startling. When the surgeon finally appeared, a woman with calm eyes and quick hands, she said, clean break. He'll walk, but it'll take time. Time, Evan thought. That's what they'd been avoiding since he was 15. When they wheeled Caleb out, groggy and pale, Evan was there. He didn't try to talk. He just followed the bed down the hallway like a shadow that had decided to come back. Recovery flattened Caleb's world to one room and a window that looked out on nothing important. Northline offered to cover rehab. Duncan stopped by with signatures. Evan showed up the next day with a thermos of real coffee and the architectural equivalent of small talk. You could have called someone else, Caleb said. I could have, Evan answered. Didn't want to. They found a rhythm. Evan handled paperwork, insurance, pharmacy runs. Caleb handled being difficult with professional skill. They talked about the city first, then the building, then, slowly, the past in fragments. You were what, 12? Caleb asked one afternoon. 15. Old enough to know better than to copy me. Still did, Evan said. You build. I build. We just used different tools. Caleb smiled at that, faint and proud. Yours hold up better in rain. The call came a week before Christmas. Evan answered, but the nurse asked for Caleb. When he took the phone, his face changed the way weather changes. One slow, unstoppable shift. Lauren, he whispered after hanging up. What happened? Evan asked. She's sick, Caleb said. Heart. They caught it late. They drove that night, trading the city's sodium light for dark interstates. Snow began somewhere around Joliet, a thin, uncertain dust. They didn't talk much. They didn't have to. The silence was finally companionable, an agreement rather than a punishment. When they reached the small Maryland hospital, the nurse recognized him immediately. She said you might come, she said to Caleb. She's been waiting. Lauren was smaller than either of them remembered, but her eyes were the same, sharp, steady, kind enough to hurt. To Monroe's, she said, voice thin but amused. Didn't think I'd see that again. Caleb stood at the foot of the bed, hands useless. Hi, Lo. Hi, she said softly. You still don't bring flowers. Didn't want to compete with you, he said, and the old rhythm made her smile. Evan sat, watching them, realizing that love can survive in ruins if you stop demanding architecture from it. They stayed 3 days. The doctors said comfortable in the way doctors do when hope is smaller than the word. Lauren talked with Evan about his projects, with Caleb about the past only once. I forgave you years ago, she said. You were just slow catching up. He bowed his head. Guess I'm here now. Guess you are, she said, and closed her eyes. She was gone the next morning. They buried her in soft ground behind the church she'd loved for its choir. The service was short. The cold did most of the speaking. When it ended, Evan stood beside his father, both of them looking at the stone as if waiting for it to answer. She saved the seat for you, Evan said quietly. Caleb nodded. I know. I just didn't think I'd fill it this way. They walked back to the car in silence. Halfway there, Evan stopped. You don't have to go back to Chicago right away. I don't have anywhere else, Caleb said. You could, Evan said. We've got another project starting in spring. Coastal job. I could use someone who listens to water. Caleb looked at him, really looked. The boy he'd missed, the man he'd met twice now under different roofs. You sure you want the complication? I already have it, Evan said. Might as well pay him. Caleb laughed, short and surprised. Fair rate. Market plus respect. They shook on it. No ceremony, no tears. Just the quiet sound of two men making work out of loss. Grief doesn't come all at once. It leaks. It showed up for Caleb 3 weeks later, back in Chicago, when he tried to climb the motel stairs and his leg reminded him of every wrong angle he'd ever forced in his life. He sat halfway up, chest tight, and for a moment he thought about quitting. The kind of quitting that means everything stops hurting because everything stops. He closed his eyes. Then he heard Evan's voice from memory. You remind me of somebody, myself. Caleb exhaled. He stood, one step, then another. Pain argued, but he'd had tougher foremen. The next day, he mailed Lauren's hospital bracelet to Maddie, now grown, with a note. Your mother built things that lasted longer than I ever could. You're one of them. Then he packed the truck and drove toward the coast. Months later, early spring, salt wind in his hair again. He stood on scaffolding that faced the Atlantic. Below, Evan's new project took shape: glass, cedar, steel. The rhythm of hammers matched the pulse in his mended leg. Evan climbed up, handed him coffee. Inspector comes tomorrow, he said. Caleb nodded. She'll pass it. You that confident? I built it like I meant it. Evan smiled. Yeah, he said. You did. They stood side by side, watching the sea throw itself against the pilings and lose beautifully. Behind them, crews laughed, gulls heckled, and the sun began its patient work of forgiving everything it touched. Spring opened like a slow door. On the coast, the mornings tasted of salt and new lumber. By 7, gulls heckled the crews from light poles, and men answered with laughter that made the wind sound less lonely. Evan's project, cedar and glass and purpose, rose clean from pilings that knew what to do in weather. The drawings had been careful. The building was more so. Caleb moved like a man whose legs still remembered winter. The break had healed into an honest ache. Never theatrical, just present. He treated stairs like negotiations and ladders like old arguments. He never reached for sympathy. He reached for rails. It was a good sight. No cheap fixes. No shortcuts that hoped a punch list would be merciful. Evan ran it with a steadiness that didn't need volume. He asked questions he already knew the answers to and listened like the answers might still surprise him. The subs respected him the way crews respect a young foreman who's learned how to be precise without being cruel. They had a rhythm, the two of them. Coffee on the scaffold edge at first light, a walk of the line before the day warmed, then each to his own weather. Evan with clipboards and conversations, Caleb with edges and seals, and the 1,000 small mercies that keep water honest. The inspector came on a Tuesday with gray hair and bright eyes. She ran her hand along a joint and smiled because it didn't snag. Somebody here listens to wind, she said. Two somebodies, Evan said. She signed with a flourish that belonged to kinder eras. Open your doors, she said, and left a trail of satisfied pen behind her. They didn't cheer. They breathed. Breathing felt better. At night, in a rented room that smelled like soap and cedar shavings, Caleb wrote without sending. Old habit, new use. He wrote to Lauren, things you only get to say when the person you loved doesn't need them anymore. He wrote about the inspector's pen and the gulls and the way Evan corrected a vendor on price without shaming the man. He wrote about the ocean's stubbornness, how it threw itself again and again at the same unmoving facts and still managed to make something smooth. He tore none of the pages out. He didn't keep them neat. He folded them once and slid them under a toolbox he'd been carrying for 20 years. Tools deserve company. Sometimes he wrote to Maddie, too. She'd answered his package with a text that could have been a blessing or a ceasefire. Thank you. I still bake Mom's bread. It rises slow. He reread that sentence 10 times and tried not to look for more in it than she'd put there. He responded once, with a photo of a scar on his shin that looked like a river on a map, and the line, some things heal into shapes you don't expect. She sent back a heart and a picture of a loaf with a split down the middle like a smile that refused to be perfect. Good enough, he thought. Good enough is sometimes holy. They opened the doors on a Saturday with no ribbon and no speeches. The developer had tried for both and been outvoted by a town that wanted to see whether the place could hold a crowd before it held a plaque. People wandered in with coffee and dogs and attitudes softened by salt. The building took them the way good buildings do, without fuss, like a jacket you forget you're wearing. Caleb stayed mostly outside, pretending to police the last of the caulk lines, and actually just practicing how to be near a success without having to own it. He liked the way the cedar smelled when sun lit it. He liked the way toddlers ran their hands along railings as if greeting a friendly animal. He liked hearing strangers say clean like a compliment. A woman stopped on the boardwalk and looked up at the soffit. She was 60, maybe, wearing a windbreaker with a baseball team that hadn't won anything important in his lifetime. You part of this? She asked. Some parts, he said. It's good, she said. Feels like it means what it says. Thank you, he said, because sometimes thank you is the only sentence that doesn't lie. Evan came out then, cheeks wind-reddened, jacket unzipped like triumph had body heat. He handed Caleb a paper cup. Not nails, he said. Actual coffee. Caleb sipped. It was bad. It was perfect. You going in? Evan asked. In a bit, Caleb said. You built the parts nobody sees, Evan said. You should see the parts everyone will. Caleb nodded and let himself be led. Inside, the light behaved exactly the way the drawings had promised, soft where mornings needed kindness, bright where afternoons could carry it. A corridor framed a long view of water. A stairwell admitted sky the way a generous host admits late guests. The lobby held a mosaic salvage from another life and reset where it could live again without nostalgia as a crutch. People drifted across it without feeling like they were trespassing. Dignity, Caleb said, almost to himself. What? Evan asked. You kept the old work and gave it dignity, Caleb said. Evan glanced at the floor, then at him. You taught me that. One way or another. They stood near a column and watched the place be used. That's the moment that tells you whether design was honest. It was. A kid ran with a paper airplane from the gift shop and didn't hit anything that would cut him. An old man with a cane found a bench exactly where his legs expected a bench. A woman discovered a quiet corner that wasn't labeled quiet and cried a little for reasons buildings don't need to know. Come see something, Evan said. He led him down a service corridor, clean, wide, painted for function. He stopped at a steel door, keyed a code, and stepped into a room full of guts. Pumps, panels, the shined-up truth of a building's circulation. We're doing this on every project, Evan said. Maintenance tours. Bring the public back here. Teach kids that beauty has a boiler room. Caleb laughed. You're going to make a lot of janitors feel like priests. They already are, Evan said. They took 5 minutes to look at each label. Someone had done it right. Fonts that could be read without squinting, arrows that pointed where the arrows said they'd point. And there, on a small laminated card near the roof access ladder, words in simple black type. Roof System Primary Contractor. Northline Services Lead Tech. C. Monroe notes. Careful is cheaper than sorry. Caleb read it twice, then looked at his son. You put that there, he said. I put what you said there, Evan answered. The name is just accurate. Caleb felt the strange pressure of pride that didn't need to expand. It could just sit where it belonged and glow a little. Thank you, he said. You earned it, Evan said. She came to the coast 2 weeks later with a suitcase that had traveled farther than he had, and a look that said she'd decided to try this particular version of courage. She met them on the boardwalk at noon. Sun insisted on everyone's faces like a truth-telling light. Mads, Caleb said, a nickname he hadn't used out loud in years. It felt right in his mouth and wrong around the edges, like a hat you used to own and now borrowed back. Dad, she said, and did not flinch. She hugged Evan first, then turned and hugged him too, brief and firm and not for show. Bread? He said, trying for levity and landing somewhere closer to reverence. In the trunk, she said. You got a kitchen that knows how to be a kitchen? We got the boiler room of your dreams, Evan said. She stayed 3 days, and in that time taught a carpentry crew how to laminate a countertop with a rolling pin and a stubborn spirit. She made beans that forgave you for all your salt sins. She sat with her father in the service corridor under the humming truth of pipe and pump and let him say nothing without punishing him for it. On the second night, she handed him a small envelope. Inside was a photo of Lauren from a summer he could smell, her hair pinned up with a pencil, her laugh about to happen. Keep it, Maddie said. We have the others. He didn't trust his voice, so he nodded. They walked after dinner along the boardwalk, 3 shadows stitching and unstitching depending on how the lights wanted to treat them. When they reached the end, Maddie turned and faced the building. She looked up like people look up at places that have decided not to hurt them. You two did good, she said. We did right, Evan said. Good and right, she said. Rare combo. They gave him a key without speeches. Evan pressed it into his palm on a weekday morning before tools came out. What's this for? Caleb asked, though he knew. Roof hatch, Evan said. If you're going to keep listening to water, might as well let yourself in. Caleb laughed. He felt the weight of it. He turned it in his fingers until the teeth caught the light and made a small, stubborn star. Keys are trust, he said. Keys are proof, Evan said. They didn't hug. They didn't need to. The key said the thing men waste too many words trying to say. Summer returned, as if surprised to find them still here. The boardwalk filled with strangers building new memories over old beams. The building settled into itself, creaks becoming a language that only people who live in a place can hear. Northline's maintenance contract kept Caleb in town, and when it didn't, Evan's next project did. They overlapped just enough to teach rhythm. They annoyed each other in small, practical ways that felt like family. Caleb rewiring a label because it should have been aligned with a different edge, Evan moving a workbench 6 inches because circulation mattered. They left notes that said saw it. Thanks. They ate too many sandwiches on crates. They discovered that arguments about trim reveal less about trim than about respect, and they learned to stop before the conversation tipped into old trenches. On a Tuesday in late July, a storm came in mean and musical. Caleb lay awake listening to it test the building, the same way he'd once listened to his life for weak seams. The roof held. The drains did what drains do when a man has paid attention with his hands. He fell asleep to the sound of rain failing to write its name inside. He dreamed, rare for him in years, of a workshop that smelled like sawdust and forgiveness. In the morning, he found a voicemail from Duncan, halfway through a story, laughing. Your kid sent me a photo of your name on a label. Told him I always knew. Guess I did. Caleb played it twice, and then saved it like a relic. In August, he drove inland for a day to sign papers he'd been avoiding, closing out the tiny storage unit in Maryland where he'd left the last physical proof of the man he used to be. The cap of a tape measure, a box of invoices from jobs he could name by smell, a crooked plaque from a builder's guild that had liked his work more than his habits. He kept the tape, recycled the invoices, left the plaque leaning against the facility dumpster where a kid might pick it up and pretend it meant something. In the bottom of the last box, he found a small tin of screws labeled in his own neat hand. For later. He laughed. He took them. On the drive back, he pulled off at a rest stop and wrote on the back of a receipt. Later is now. The screws fit. He didn't know yet where they'd go. He didn't need to. It felt good to carry a thing that had finally found its time. In September, they hosted their first maintenance tour in that boiler room. 10 middle schoolers, 2 impatient teachers, 1 custodian who smiled the whole time because someone was finally calling his work beautiful. Evan explained pressure differentials without condescension. Caleb showed them a scupper he kept clean on purpose and talked about how water is both honest and sneaky. A girl in the back raised her hand. Are you two related? She asked. Evan and Caleb glanced at each other. Not a joke, not a dodge, just a look that decided truth was simpler. Yeah, Evan said. He's my dad. The kids nodded as if that were obvious and therefore uninteresting. They moved on to pumps. The custodian wiped a sudden something from his eye and said it was dust. After the tour, Evan and Caleb stood alone among labels and hum. They didn't say much. They didn't have to. At dusk, they climbed to the roof and leaned on the parapet that shed water exactly where it should. The ocean played its same old song in a new key. The boardwalk lights came on one by one like small promises being kept. Mom would have liked this, Evan said. She would have fixed your signs kerning first, Caleb said. Evan laughed. True. They stood until the air cooled into sweater weather. A gull decided it was time to go to sleep and told everyone about it. Somewhere below, someone locked a door and whistled on his way to a car. Caleb took the key from his pocket and turned it in his palm without looking at it, like prayer beads for people who prefer bolts to incense. You did it, Evan said, quietly enough that the wind could have taken it if it had wanted to. We did it, Caleb said. They watched the dark deepen in strips. The world, for once, didn't require any more from them than being present. Years later, when the building needed its first new coat of oil on the cedar and the kids from that maintenance tour had kids of their own, someone would ask the custodian where to find the roof hatch key. He'd point to a hook labeled in clear black type, roof/keep dry/Monroe. By then, the name would mean care more than identity. It would mean the seams were where they should be and the water respected them. It would mean the people inside could go about their lives without having to think about what kept them safe. That, finally, would be the point. Caleb would still carry letters unwritten and some written, and a small tin of screws labeled for later that he had used, piece by patient piece, whenever the world offered a place they belonged. He would walk a little slower, but the building would not. It would hold. And on clear evenings when work let them, father and son would climb the hatch they both had keys to, stand where the wind told the truth, and choose to look out instead of back. No speeches. No applause. Just a man who once mistook pride for purpose and a son who learned the difference, shoulder to shoulder above a roof that didn't leak. The world below going on. The water going where it should. The names on a small card, accurate and enough. The return, not loud, but finally complete.